Hello and welcome everyone to the Shadowproof channel. My name is Mickey Huff. I'm the director of Project Censored and the president of the Media Freedom Foundation. And I am here to be a guest host today for Kevin Gosztola at the Shadowproof channel to be part of an historic conversation that Kevin Gosztola is going to have with famed whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. I'm also a publisher with Andy Lee Roth at the Censored Press. And this past year, we've had the great pleasure of working with Kevin Gosztola on his book, Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, with a foreword by Abby Martin. This is an extraordinary, timely, and important book about the Assange case and what it portends for press freedom. That's why today I'm honored to be here to guest host this historic conversation between Kevin Gosztola, author of Guilty of Journalism, and Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, goes back to the Pentagon Papers fame. He had leaked these papers in 1969, and through the early 1970s, he struggled to get the truth about what was happening in the Vietnam War to the American public. After being exonerated in a 1973 case on the grounds of governmental misconduct against him, Ellsberg spent much of the rest of his life here fighting for press freedom and championing whistleblowers. Ellsberg is the author of 4 books: The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner; Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers; Risk, Ambiguity, and Decision; and Papers on the War. He was a distinguished research fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a distinguished researcher at UMass Amherst W.E.B. Du Bois Library, and a senior fellow of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Daniel Ellsberg also contributed a piece 10 years ago to our Project Censored annual book. It was an important piece on civil courage and its punishments, about the importance of whistleblowers and truth tellers. Well, Kevin Gosztola is no stranger to whistleblowers. He's been covering the whistleblower beat for well over a decade, and we've also championed Kevin Gosztola's work. Again, so much so that we are now publishing his first major book, Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Here now is a conversation between Kevin Gosztola and Daniel Ellsberg.
We're fast approaching the 4th anniversary of Julian Assange being thrown out of the Ecuador embassy and put into jail. And especially, though we don't have to get into all of the details, especially given your life announcement recently, I just wanted to ask you about the passage of time as it applies to Julian Assange, because it's something that I think about as I follow this case, and how we're talking about what I wrote about in my book. We're talking about events that unfolded 13 to 14 years ago. The passage of time usually has factored into criminal cases. Usually it factors against its weight against them sometimes when you're considering bringing them against a person. But Julian Assange has considered figures like Michael Ratner, who's no longer with us, who was a very good human rights attorney who represented him. He's lost Gavin McFadden, who was a figure in some way that he looked up to. And so I would just like to get your view of, what you find most alarming about the fact that this keeps marching onward and doesn't have a resolution yet.
Well, it hasn't. I think on that point, the government, the regime, would have been very happy to get him. Let me modify that a little. On the one hand, they would be very happy to bring him to trial in Alexandria in particular, to extradite him, to get him on trial, and with the expectation that in the post 9/11 world of law and attitude, that he would be convicted. And the Supreme Court has never yet ruled on the constitutionality of applying the Espionage Act to anyone other than a spy who gives secret information to a foreign power generally with intent to harm the United States, especially in wartime. That's where it's been used primarily or exclusively before my case in 1971. So I was the first one tried, as I said, for a non-espionage case under the so-called Espionage Act. That's not its official name, as you know. It's 18 U.S.C. 793, especially paragraphs D and E. And as a non-lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a defendant, that's the one law I can trip off my tongue quickly, because I was the first non-spy, and they didn't accuse me of being a spy. People misreported that often. But the person who was not being charged with espionage to be charged under that act, at both paragraphs D and E. Actually. And E is particularly for people who did not have authorized access to the material for which they are a source. I was an authorized person with the Pentagon Papers to have it, as was Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, when she had access to the material she gave over. And that's true in most of the cases that have been brought. It's never been brought, as you know, against a journalist before. And despite Bill Keller's despicable, I would say, allegation that he doesn't recognize Julian Assange as a journalist, I suppose part of the fact that most journalists I have come to realize as a whistleblower do not really regard sources as part of the journalistic process. The journalism begins with the person I give it to, and the source is sort of, I come to realize, is sort of like a policeman's criminal informant, a snitch, who disobeys the rules of his organization. If he's in the mafia, subject to death, and even if he's not in the mafia, but he's a criminal. And he's very, very useful to the policeman. He doesn't want to share him with any other policeman or police person because useful information. He wants to build his career or her career on that information. But he doesn't really have that much respect or concern. And I will say that journalists do show a good deal of concern for concealing the identity of the source. And I'm sorry if I sound cynical here. I'm talking out of a good deal of experience of talking to whistleblowers other than myself. They don't feel that the journalist in the end has shown as much concern as they expected, often in the beginning. I actually don't know a whistleblower of the kind we're talking about here who regrets what she or he has done, even when they've almost all, the known ones, you know them only when the law has entrapped them, and not the anonymous ones. But I've talked to a lot of those. I made it my effort to meet a lot of them because I identify with them, and I've been through the mill, and I can give them some advice and reassurance, and generally my admiration for what they've done. I found that it's very hard to find one who ends the process with without great complaint against the journalist they've dealt with. I don't think anyone has ever said that. I've never seen that before as a generalization or even a selective case, because they don't fight them in, they're happy the material got out, as certainly I am, for example. But they all are. They're happy the material got out in nearly all cases. There's a few where they didn't really intend it. And they generally start with a very friendly relationship with the journalist. And in some cases, certainly mine and a number of others, you feel you're part of a movement, say, against war or nuclear weapons or intervention or against the Constitution or something. And you kind of assume that the journalist is on your side and taking this as a liberal, if that's who you're dealing with, or even a progressive, even if their editors are not that liberal or progressive. But you sort of start with the assumption and they encourage the assumption that we're together in this, somehow we're getting this out. And it seems very natural presumption. If people against the war, presume they welcome the opportunity to put out some truth that might actually help shorten it. But it turns out, as these people nearly all find out, that the concern either for keeping their identity or how they present the materials does not really extend to the source very much. They don't regard them as being on the same team as the source may originally mistakenly imagine. So coming back to Assange, I perceived immediately that he was treated in a way very familiar to me by the Times, even terribly contemptuously. Bill Keller, maybe in some ways that I don't know, a very fine person and a good journalist. From what I do know of him, of his treatment of Chelsea Manning and Assange and others, he's a horse's ass. You know, one of the jerks of the world, sort of an Elon Musk is revealing himself, I think, in those terms. And when Bill Keller says, I don't recognize him as a journalist, and then he prints a front page story introducing the world to Julian Assange, which describes him as this unkempt character looking like a bag lady. Look, we're talking here about a computer guy who lives at night on his computer, pretty much, or around the clock. He was originally a hacker, as some of the others. This is his life. And so he didn't look like a Times reporter, which I guess has some of the standards of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI agents, somehow, I guess. And he smelled bad. Now, what was the last time you saw that described of anyone? Have you ever heard anyone described as smelling bad? This is a source. So Julian didn't expect that kind of treatment. He was very dismayed by it. And I had to say, Julian, I could have told you exactly what would come here. I haven't ever publicized it at all. I'll tell you why. But I was treated even worse than that by the New York Times Magazine section in a disastrous profile that was done of me, which was misleading in almost every paragraph. And I've never talked about that publicly. Why don't any of the leakers and sources come out like me and criticize the dealings with the papers, or the papers as they see them? Because we want to get the word out. It's got to be through a newspaper. No one wants to antagonize the media. And like every profession, they don't like criticism, even of their colleagues, even if they don't like those particular colleagues. That's like lawyers and doctors. They don't testify against each other. So, and they don't like to hear it. So you may want to get something else out, as certainly I did. So I never wanted to antagonize the New York Times. As you know, I'm coming to a point here where I don't have to worry whether I antagonize the New York Times. So I will say, and I'm not going to go into details, my dealings with the New York Times were not less frustrating than those of Julian Assange and some of the others. And I do think of that as a defect because of their craft, because they could get an awful lot more information if they had more respect for source, and if they probed for what's there, which they generally don't. Sometimes they do. Good investigative reporters, certainly Cy Hirsch, who does not try to maintain his access to sources in general, to government officials, by dining with them and playing tennis with them and being part of their club, the officials' club. And let me get away from the relations with the sources to a more general point that it's the kind of thing you cover, Kevin. I used to be asked, often 10 years after the Pentagon Papers, it's been 50 years now, but I've often been asked, how do you weigh the way the press is doing now compared to 1971 when they printed the Pentagon Papers and I got more coverage than I could have dreamed of, that is, the papers did, because of the effort by Nixon and Attorney General Mitchell, disastrous to them, of trying to enjoin the New York Times. And then when I gave it to the Post, they enjoined the Post. So I gave it to one paper after another. A friend of mine, Gar Alperovitz, who didn't want to be known as a source until recently, wonderful historian and scholar, but he was very involved in this process with me for other reasons, personal reasons. And I was inclined to put it all out, so we didn't have the web then to put it out, but to get it out before the FBI could nail maybe stop it. And he said, no, I'll give him credit for this. He said, do it one at a time. He'd worked for Congress. And he says, stretch it out. That'll give more attention to it. Well, the effect was, and there were 4 injunctions, and then they stopped because they simply realized they could not stop this, and eventually got to 17 newspapers, as I recall. So, or was that 17 in addition to the Post and the Times? I've forgotten the arithmetic now. But the prosecution had to say eventually, we can't stop this with injunctions. It's like, I remember the prosecutor saying, it's like trying to herd bees and, just out there. Well, now that was a glorious moment for the press, which they take almost no credit for. It was a wave of civil disobedience, which is what they were doing. Not one of them wanted to acknowledge that because they don't like civil disobedience. They don't get treated well, in particular in the New York Times. And for instance, Abe Rosenthal, the editor of the New York Times at the time, managing editor, did a wonderful job getting this through and getting the documents in, despite the fact that he supported the war. And I don't give him credit for that, but I give him a lot of credit as a newsman for getting this stuff out, despite the fact that it contradicted policies he'd supported. Very good. But, okay, I'll tell you something I've never said publicly. A friend of mine on the Times informed me that Abe Rosenthal hated me. What? How could that be? Well, first, I'm an anti-war activist. He didn't respect any of them. He was for the war anyway. So as an establishment person, he didn't like the Berrigans. He didn't like anybody. He didn't like David Harris, and he didn't like me. But more important than that, he was furious at me, I was told very authoritatively, because by revealing my identity to Walter Cronkite, and otherwise, while the FBI was searching for me, I had taken the attention away from the New York Times. It became a Daniel Ellsberg story to a considerable extent, instead of we have this anonymous source. A reason, I think, why they love their sources to be anonymous. It's, obviously it's for the benefit of the source to a large extent, but it turns out also for the press. They don't have to share attention, again, from their revelations to the to the source. And in that case, now I said to the person I was talking to, I'd always made it clear to Neil Sheehan on the Times that if I were indicted, which was almost certain, but not quite certain, I was not aware of any indictments, but I assumed there had been and that I just didn't happen to be aware of them. But I assumed if there's been so few that I don't even I don't know about them from being in the government for a decade, and seeing a lot of leaks, they must have known the source in a number of those cases. Others they didn't, but often they must have known who the source was, and they didn't seem to indict him as far as I could see. I didn't know that was for constitutional reasons, that they felt they didn't have a British type Official Secrets Act, which would have made it clear cut. And they don't, the British, who didn't have our War of Independence, our revolution, do have an Official Secrets Act. And they do have officially a monarch who cannot be impeached. He's above the law. So we made some advances, I would say, in terms of freedom and democracy in our War of Independence. And because we don't have, as you point out in your book, right at the beginning, we do not have a British type Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any and all release of protected information that they don't want out. No intent involved, just did you do it, and so forth. Now, that's the way they're using the Espionage Act since my case, and above all by Obama and then Trump and now Biden.
So the media, this is something that I deal with in the book, and also we wanted to make sure we raised that Andrew Coburn did this fantastic feature story for Harper's Magazine called Alternative Facts: How the Media Failed Julian Assange. And he also incorporated some details from my book into the feature. He used it as a kind of guide to help him question and account for all the misrepresentations that the media, these news organizations, particularly in the US, but also The Guardian, have engaged in collectively. One example being something like a good example is David Lee, and I think even Nick Davies saying that Julian Assange.
Luke Harding, I think. Go ahead.
Well, so my example is going to be that there was this quote that was shared that Julian Assange almost certainly never uttered that Afghan informants deserve to die. That is something that David Lee said in, it was quoted in a PBS Frontline documentary. And the Der Spiegel journalists who worked with Julian Assange say he never expressed anything of that nature. It has been used to defame Julian Assange. And so let me move this forward a little bit beyond.
Let me just say, since you've given that anecdote, I want to take advantage of this. One of my late interviews in live here now.
Go for it.
You may have noticed I'm using language that I really have never used before, and I'm criticizing the media in a way I was afraid to do, like other sources. I don't want to antagonize people that I might want to share stories with eventually, but that's not going to go on. Okay, David Lee, or Lay, whatever his name, and Nick Davies, the other people who said that, who with Luke Harding revealed the passcode, the password that enabled these unredacted State Department cables to be released. They had done it in their book, which I saw. But in their general attacks from The Guardian on this major source, I can identify David Lee as another jerk, a real jerk. And the Guardian as a whole doesn't look good. Alan Rusbridger, the editor, pretty good at printing this stuff, but the people under him have an almost campaign against Julian. It's bizarre. I don't know. We have to go into that. Very bad performance. I started to generalize long ago, and I didn't say it in this monologue here, that people would ask me, how is the press doing? And, compared to the end, and how do you think it's going? I say, well, there's two ways to answer that, I've said in the past. One is, how are they doing? Terribly, but better than any other institution in our government structure. Look at compared to the Supreme Court in recent years, Congress, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. No use even talking about that now. So the press looks better than any of those. The other way of saying that is they're better than any other institution, but terribly. They're doing terribly. What was it, 30 years for the Gulf War after, or 20 years after the Pentagon Papers, after Vietnam, and then for the Iraq War.
Yep.
In each case, they were as misled by the executive, as willingly, as easily as in Vietnam. There was no improvement there. Rightly so, the government has even found new ways to suppress truth in the press, but they go along with it pretty easily.
One of my favorite movies of all time, which is from the era of film watching that you were doing. I remember in your Secrets book that you mentioned seeing Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Howard Zinn. But another Robert Redford,
I watched it with him.
Another Robert Redford film that is quintessential, I think, to a conversation.
Day of the Condor.
3 Days of the Condor, yes.
3 Days of the Condor, yeah.
And I wanted to say that question of at the end where we see the New York Times and the CIA company man asks, how do you know they'll print it? I think that's something that should enter our conversation here. And
What
I put
was
that
the
to you.
question?
How do you
I know the question. How do you say it?
How do you know they'll print it? That's what the CIA man says to Robert Redford at the end, because Robert Redford's character, Joe Turner, says that he's just blown the whistle on the underground assassination network inside the CIA. And he's gone inside the New York Times building and he's given him the allegations. And as he's walking away, the CIA man, this is a Cliff Robertson character, looks at Robert Redford's character and says, well, and this is kind of him saying that you didn't necessarily beat us, because how do you know that the news media is going to publish your claims about our underground assassination network? And I think, we've talked about the way they demean sources. They don't want to have to share ownership, but we have countless examples in the last 20 years of journalists flat out not publishing material that was brought to their attention. And I think that's something that we have to contemplate too in this case with Julian Assange and the way that the government has been able to go to war against WikiLeaks, because what WikiLeaks did was publish material that probably the New York Times and the Washington Post would not have published. And it put them in a position where they had to deal with the fact that material they wouldn't publish was now being shared by all of us, and they didn't want to have to deal with it in their newspapers.
Good question. It brings me back to someone I was discussing a little earlier. I remember the 3 days of the Condor. You reminded me. My memory of the ending was that he looks up at the triangular building, then the New York Times building with its, they now call, thing like, what do you call it, that goes underneath, the crawl that goes underneath, and they had a crawl-in lights over there, and the New York Times is going to publish this, isn't that right? But I didn't remember the little question that you just mentioned, which is, how do you know they're going to publish it? Well, they had just shown definite courage, as did the Washington Post and 17 other newspapers, who each of them defied an attorney general who was saying, this is treason. He didn't use the word treason, but he implied it. This is against the U.S. national security right at this moment. And the president was saying it, and they said, we've looked at it, not very long in some cases. They went with the New York Times example, which is why the New York Times is such an important place to put this. And they decided the Attorney General was wrong. They didn't agree that it endangered national security. And of course, I'm the good whistleblower now, because 50 years later, no one has ever found any way in which it endangered national security. As, by the way, Erwin Griswold, who represented the government in the civil case to enjoin the New York Times and the others, had said at the time, endangers national security. Years later at a conference and in an op-ed in the Washington Post said, I never saw any reason to believe that this endangered national security. Contradicted what he'd said before the Supreme Court, but then, he's a lawyer. And not a defense lawyer either. So can you be sure they'll print this stuff? Let me tell you a secret that I've never told. Why not? I'm not holding anything back now. And you'll see why I was reluctant before. A year ago, just about exactly a year ago, I gave the New York Times, Charlie Savage, New York Times, a 350-page study or something like that by my old colleague, Morton Halpern, who had done it top secret for the Rand Corporation, for the Defense Department. And 2/3 of it had been declassified, but a third was still top secret. And it had to do with the nuclear threats we had made and were ready to carry out to protect Taiwan from Chinese assault, and even the offshore islands, a mile and a half from the mainland, which they regarded as part of the defense of Taiwan. So I wanted to say, the Economist had just had a piece on the cover with showing Taiwan with crosshairs on it. So it's the most dangerous place in the world. And so I wanted to reveal to the American public, I think the study was done in 60, I saw it from the beginning, I worked on it, but 66, 64, 66, more than half a century ago. And I thought it's time for people to know that, we thought it then, defending Taiwan was worth blowing the world with starting a nuclear with it. Eisenhower expected, he said, in top secret communications, part that they had not declassified, he expected the Russians to respond to this with nuclear attacks, which would mean, as I knew, having worked on the war plans in 61, in the Eisenhower period, an attack anywhere by even a non-nuclear attack on American forces, and we had American forces in Taiwan then, any attack would call for an all-out attack on Russia, Soviet Union, and China. So what he was saying was, yes, if this blockade against the offshore islands is continued and we can't break it, just by going through it, if they're shelling our ships, we're going to do something that starts the process of destroying at least the Northern Hemisphere. They didn't know about nuclear winter then, which would also take out the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, so I released that to the New York Times, and of course revealed myself as the source. And Charlie Savage did a good story on this, and I said that I would welcome. I was younger then, but not a lot younger, a year younger. I was 91. So I said, I would be glad to be prosecutor on this because I'm not going to plea a bargain plea. The others have pled bargains in almost every cases to get only 30 or 40 months in prison, or 55 or something like that, rather than a life sentence. And I'd been charged with what amounted to a life sentence, 115 years. Julian is facing 175 years, but in both cases, that's basically a life sentence. But I said, a life sentence to me doesn't mean what it used to mean 50 years ago to me. I was ready to face that then, but now life sentence is not going to weigh on me too heavily. I'm 91. No prosecution for this. All right. So what I hadn't told Charlie, I'll now reveal it. I hope he doesn't mind too much. I hadn't told him because I thought it might deter him from this scoop, that I had given that study, top secret, when it was all top secret, to Tom Wicker of the New York Times, a friend of mine, wonderful journalist. I think he's probably a Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the best journalists. I think he might have been head. I think he was head then of the Washington office. I'm not sure. But I gave it to him on my way to give it to the Japanese political parties. Gave it to him. I put it out in Japan. It was out in I had a press conference, never talked about this publicly. There's public in Japan. Every party was represented except the main party, the liberal, control them. It's essentially a one-party state, but it has a lot of other parties, under it that compete. So they were all there. And I put this thing on the table. I said, you should know that Japan was very explicitly in the study, a hostage would be treated as a nuclear target if we started a nuclear war. For one thing, because all of our warships had nuclear weapons in Japanese harbor, which the public didn't know, and their government denied. So, but anyway, we had American bases there, planes would be coming off from Japan. So I thought the Japanese public deserved to know that the president was secretly endangering them at this time. Okay. Then on my way to Japan, I thought, better if I make sure that the Americans have this before I give it to foreigners, right? So on my way to Japan, I dropped into Washington and I gave Tom Wicker this article. None of it ever appeared. So what Charlie Savage revealed last year had been in the hands of the New York Times. This would have been 80, something like 82, 83, I think it was 82. So that's 40 years ago. So I thought if I mentioned to him that they had it and chose not to run it then, that might discourage him. He might look a little deeper into whether he ought to run it now. I could understand that. So I didn't mention it to him. I didn't lie, but I didn't reveal that particular part of the past. And I also thought it's going to be hard for them. Frankly, they can prosecute me, but I've got a pretty good case here because they know perfectly well that I gave this to these parties in Japan at that time. And the Japanese have an ability it was in a parliament building, a diet building, and they use their regular diet stenographers or translators. They translated it into Japanese almost overnight. It was astonishing. It's like the congressional record, gets all this stuff in, but they were translating it. So it was available in Japan, this top secret study. A New York, rather International Herald Tribune reporter was at this press conference. I've forgotten his name. He writes a long story about what I said to the press, which had a lot to do with Taiwan and other things about our relations with Japan. I told a lot of things. And he didn't mention that I had put an explicitly top secret study on the table in front of these people, who immediately copied it and given it here. It's not in the story, and it's a long story. I think there could only have been a phone call from somebody who said, that's top secret, don't run it. Must have checked it with somebody to send it. It's not mentioned. It was never mentioned in the press in the US that I had done this. So I didn't get prosecuted that time. This is after the Pentagon Papers.
Well, I need to wind this down, but I'm going to throw one last question your way, and then we will end this interview. I want to first bring up the fact that since you said Edward Snowden, we should raise the matter of how the third indictment against Julian Assange incorporated the support that WikiLeaks provided to Edward Snowden as a source.
Oh, I'm not sure I knew that.
Yes, it's in.
You follow the trail. I didn't know that.
In June 2020, they criminalized WikiLeaks for sending Sarah Harrison to Hong Kong to help Edward Snowden leave. And of course, we know the story. He gets stuck in the Moscow airport because his passport is revoked. And so you have the issue of, I wonder if you could draw a parallel with the Pentagon Papers, you disclosing it to journalists, and if any journalists had been accused of helping you evade the FBI, would they have been legally liable if we're going to apply the way the Justice Department is pursuing Assange now?
As I discussed with Charlie at the time, Charlie Savage, just to make sure this is all clear, there's no question that he and the Times editors who approved this and the secretaries who dealt with it on the Times were as indictable as I was. He mentioned under the plain language of the act, which needs to be amended in various ways, which has been done, by the way, by Rashida Tlaib, following on a different version from Tulsi Gabbard's earlier. And it was in dealing with that. Yes. Not only Savage is indictable, that's the way it is, and the publisher, yes, they have until now refrained actually from taking on the New York Times for a lot of reasons. I'll just mention one. Carl Bernstein wrote a long piece in Rolling Stone. I think it was, Rolling Stone. Why in Rolling Stone? He couldn't get it published anywhere else. And it was a long piece about CIA dealings with journalists, in which he said 500 journalists had aided the CIA knowingly. I think 500 had security clearances or non-disclosure agreements, which would seem to compromise them as journalists significantly. And he said their number one asset was the New York Times for getting out information, conceal this and we'll give you that. There's many examples of that. I could give, but we've been going on here for a long time. So, and that's true not only of the Times, of course. These 500 are all across the board. So they didn't want to take on the Times. They need the Times, even though it does expose things, not infrequently, that they don't want out. But that just enhances the credibility of the Times from the government's point of view. When from New York Times, they're doing their job, but they're doing it about 1/100th of the time and extent they should be doing. And from the government's point of view, we'll accept and we won't prosecute these people for embarrassing us occasionally, as long as they'll align themselves with us, as long as they won't put out stories like the surveillance story for a year. the TAM. We need that. And so they don't prosecute him yet. And yet it has been true for half a century. Someday, and the ACLU predicted that it would be Trump who would indict a journalist, which Obama, who had indicted more sources than anyone else, you go into why, you tell a little bit more why. It's always puzzled me. How did he get into that position? Well, he hated leaks, but all presidents hate leaks. Why was it under him that there were so many prosecutions? I was learning from that at midnight last night from your book, reading it. But it was clear that, so Trump didn't care about that, of course, that it was he didn't even like the New York Times. Didn't he call it the failing New York Times all the time? He hated the Washington Post even worse, it seems. But so he wasn't afraid to, I think as you mentioned in the book, there was an earlier effort by Nixon to prosecute the New York Times. And that the grand jury was dismissed before bringing indictments, apparently because those people had been overheard illegally without a warrant, as I had. Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Richard Falk, my friends. They didn't get indicted in the end because almost surely they asked, have we been overheard? Now it's against Assange. And if Assange is convicted, and extradited, if he's extradited and convicted, every journalist in the world has a zero, has an X on their back, a laser target from if they print anything that is classified of the 100% of stuff that's classified, of which 5% should be classified. 5% is a lot, but 95% is even more. And say it's a few years old, as in, look, the Charlie Savage case is 50 years old. So they don't want to argue. I was looking forward to arguing in court. This is before I know that my life would be shorter than I had expected. But I was looking forward to arguing in court and saying, do you really say it's going to endanger national security to put out information that's 50 years old? Now, granted, it was very current. The crisis is going on about Taiwan. I'm not sure I could have prevailed. It does affect U.S. policy with respect to Taiwan. Right now, that's why I put it out when you come down to it. But still, I would like to see them argue explicitly in court that they must protect a policy of readiness and threat to blow up the world, to hold on to Taiwan, which I think would not look a lot better than Putin's monstrous threats to blow up the world to protect Crimea, his hold in Crimea, and the Donbass, which he has defined as Russia. Now, why isn't he being denounced as that's an unconscionable threat, immoral, insane, which it is, because NATO has been making that threat for 70 years and is still doing it. And not very actively, because we now have a conventional, non-nuclear superiority to the Russians in that area. Because the Warsaw Pact has changed sides and is now in NATO. So we have a huge superiority. We don't need nuclear threats, though it's still our policy. They can't denounce Putin for making these insane threats, to take an insane action to initiate nuclear war, because it's their policy still. That should change. Sorry. Biden needs that threat for Taiwan, where we don't have a conventional superiority in that region. Now, do you have to threaten nuclear war to keep the Chinese from invading? No, I don't really think so, any more than Putin. Well, Putin may feel he has to threaten that to hold on to the Donbass against American intervention if we intervene directly. But if we do intervene directly, he will say to hold on to this part of Russia whose existence is threatened, the Crimea or the Donbass or Zaporizhia or whatnot. We can do that against Ukrainians. Against American pilots and missiles and whatnot directly, not so clearly. That's where I fear that he would use he would carry out his threats to initiate at least a small nuclear war, which has, of course, every risk. He would hope not, but every risk of blowing up and causing nuclear winter. Okay, I'll say right now, anyone in the government, in the Russian government, well, a citizen can't even object to this without getting imprisoned, and in many cases tortured, like Navalny in Russia for objecting to this. That's not true here. Yeah. So people who object to this policy can say you should not be threatening or preparing to blow the world up. That's a shorthand for it. Doesn't kill everybody, actually, but 90 to 98%, yes, from the smoke in the stratosphere that shuts out the sunlight and destroys all the harvests. So no nation in the world should accept that without the utmost condemnation and resistance. And if anyone, as I've said before in other occasions, any American I'll speak to, but this is just as true in every other country, some of which is the dangers of doing what I'm saying are much greater. Anybody who knows that the public in the world is being lied to by their officials, or that preparations are being made that may well be carried out to cause nuclear winter or to initiate nuclear war. Of course, a Russian who knows that now, or someone in the US who knows that about Taiwan, something, should consider at any cost personally to telling the truth that may avert a nuclear war, or any kind of war, actually. I can't say they should individually do it, but if they think they should consider doing what I wish I had done earlier in 1964 or 61, when I had top secret information with access to it that could have averted the Vietnam War. Of course, I should have put that out earlier. So I say, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are actually falling. Get it out, get it to the New York Times first, if they'll print the documents, get it to El País or Spiegel or even the Guardian. Behave so badly with respect to Assange. Don't expect respect or concern from the Guardian or some of these others or the Times, but that's not an issue. It's not a question of whether you should be called names, which have kept Democrats from opposing wars for generations here, not only Vietnam, but all the others. That's not a sufficient reason for not telling the truth here. And so people should have the moral courage that our soldiers routinely exhibit in combat with respect to their lives. But it's very rare to find an official who will risk her or his career or clearance or access or election or any of this. Well, unless there is more moral courage, come back, in the press and in Congress and in military than we've seen in the past, I don't think we'll survive the consequences of climate change or avoiding nuclear war. So everything depends on it. Is even a small chance, which is all I faced, frankly, or said Snowden, a small chance of affecting, this ripping apart of the Constitution in Snowden's case, or of ending a war and avoiding a war's worth of lives at stake. Of course, it's worth any personal cost to consider and to do it, actually. You're willing to do it. And it is, we have only a small chance, but everything is at stake. It's worth pursuing it. So you're in a potentially noble profession, Kevin. And as you didn't mention in this excellent article on Harper's by Andrew Coburn, who's terrific on the question of the military-industrial complex and on how the media failed Julian Assange, terrific article. You naturally didn't mention you were the single investigative journalist who is singled out by name in your book and in your reporting for having covered this properly and courageously and meticulously. And so I give you that tribute too, just as Andrew does. And I think others will avail themselves of your information in your book.
Well, let's end there, Dan. I really appreciate your time. And I thank you again for the endorsement that you gave to the book. And I wish you the best. And you seem like you're at peace, and I'm very happy for you.
Well, the world is not at peace, but we're doing what we can.
John Shipton, Julian Assange's father, calls it the difficulty of destiny. And this is what is chronicled in the film that's touring the country right now in the United States, Ithaca, that Julian Assange's brother produced. I'm just mentioning that and plugging it in addition to my book, because there are screenings that people who watch this live stream, this broadcast, they might be able to go see in the United States in different locations. But the difficulty of destiny, not the idea that an individual can be a hero and change the world, but the idea that people who are trapped in these predicaments, these circumstances, have to struggle and try to transform it. These Belmarsh tribunals that we participated in, rallies, the pressuring of Congress people, we're all trapped in these predicaments, and it's all up to us to try and transform it. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you for the chance.
This is Mickey Huff again, Director of Project Censored, President of the Media Freedom Foundation, and I've been a guest host here today at the Shadowproof channel. Kevin Gosztola has spent the last decade reporting on Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and the wider war on whistleblowers. He is the co-founder and managing editor of Shadowproof, an independent news outlet focused on systemic abuses of power in business and government, and the curator of the Dissenter Newsletter. Kevin also produces and co-hosts the weekly podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, and Truthout. He has been a featured guest on Democracy Now!, The Real News Network, CounterSpin, Al Jazeera English, and of course, the Project Censored show. He is co-author of Truth and Consequences. He is also the author, most recently, of a book just out today on the Censored Press with 7 Stories Press. That book was the subject of the conversation, the historic conversation you just heard between Kevin Gosztola and famed whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Again, the book, Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, with a foreword by Abby Martin. In this book, investigative reporter Kevin Gosztola provides an essential guide to the case against WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange, and the deeper stakes for the future of a free press. This is an unprecedented case where the U.S. government has charged a publisher with violating the Espionage Act in an attempt to silence them. Gosztola fearlessly investigates the political motivations, legal abuses, and cynical maneuverings that have kept Assange captive and subject to inhumane conditions. Exposing angles of the case that will never be discussed in an open courtroom, including the historical roots of the CIA's war against Assange and WikiLeaks, and the prosecution's reliance on a serial liar and criminal sociopath as a key informant, Gosztola meticulously documents how state and private actors have colluded to punish a journalist fiercely committed to transparency, truth-telling, and uncovering the secrets of the powerful. The stakes are high, not only for Assange, but also for journalists everywhere and for democracies that depend on a free press. Get your copy of Guilty of Journalism today at censoredpress.org or 7stories.com. Again, I'm Mickey Huff from Project Censored. Thanks for watching.